mother. Okay. Yeah, we are ready to start on the panel discussion, which involves all the speakers. And this panel discussion will be moderated by Rania Afuni. Rania has 10 years of entrepreneurship experience and another 10 years in academia between Beirut and Riyadh. She was partner in a software company providing IT consulting, and she had taught at the American University of Beirut and the Lebanese American University, where she was also in charge of managing their School of Business International accreditation process. She is currently a researcher at McGill University in Montreal, pursuing a PhD on AI in management. Her research includes impact of AI on jobs, human-AI collaboration, and knowledge creation. She is member of the Montreal AI Ethics Group and also member of LebNet, the premier Lebanese diaspora tech network in North America. Rania, please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Ash, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. AI is power, and with power comes responsibility. A responsibility to deliver trustable knowledge, to make fair decisions, and most importantly, to benefit humanity. With today's sometimes widely misunderstood AI, there's a pressing need for a global multidisciplinary discussion on its impact on businesses, on the economy, and on society at large. A discussion of its benefits, but also its harms. And it's everyone's business, but more so the business of experts, whether they are researchers, policymakers, consumers of the technology, or producers of it. Let me tell you very briefly a recent story. Less than 2 weeks ago, Elon Musk, the man behind Tesla and the OpenAI Research Institute, he made it his business to stand for responsible AI, or to be more loyal to the facts of the story, he actually made it his out of business because he left OpenAI. He left it, why? Because his research team developed a bot that can generate plausible fake news. And without any human intervention, so purely AI. They developed an AI that started writing about, and now I'm really quoting exactly what the AI wrote, about Russia declaring war on the United States after Donald Trump accidentally fired a missile in the air. It's not really believable. Well, honestly, when I saw fired missile in the air, فكرت ابنه نجح بالبروفيه بس إنه. But still, it's dangerously fake news. And it's deceiving. Elon Musk had called AI a demon in the past, and OpenAI was actually his initiative to try and tame that demon. And his purpose for OpenAI was to make AI friendly and available to all. His departure confirms to us that debates about the impact of AI are both critical and timely. Today, in line with this, and to tell us their perspective on those impacts, we have we're actually fortunate to have with us experts with a rich diversity of backgrounds, as you have seen from their presentations and from Dr. Naash's introduction of them. So thank you all for being with us today. And let me start with a question for you, Mr. Chase. So you have written about, first let me ask you about something you mentioned earlier. There's a heated debate now globally about the ethics of AI. And I heard you mention earlier that you had a reservation on the term ethics when it's employed in that particular context. And although I'm a member of the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, you convinced me. So, yeah, I know. So why don't you share with us your reservation on the term?
So there's a small but growing industry of people who go to conferences around the world to discuss the ethics of AI. I was at one recently in Dubai, which is an interesting place to be discussing AI because, as has been said earlier, they have a minister for AI there, and they take AI very seriously. the government appears to be infused with singularitarianism, which is amazing. I am nervous about the use of ethics in the context of discussions about what makes AI beneficial or not beneficial, because it gives a moral layer to questions which I think are more pragmatic. AI is a very powerful technology. Fire, in its time, was our most powerful technology, and later electricity was our most powerful technology. I'm pretty sure cavemen didn't think about fire ethics, but that's a long time ago, we'll never know. I don't think the Victorians talked about electricity ethics. They talked about how to make electricity safe and how to minimize the dangers. And I think that's the sort of language we should be using about AI as well. If you talk about things in a moral context, then if somebody disagrees with you, they're not just being imprudent, they're actually bad. And if people are bad, it's harder to have a proper discussion with them because they become evil. And that's what makes me a bit nervous when people talk about AI ethics. What we should be doing in talking about the benefits and dangers of AI is working out what is the right balance to strike between making data available to companies and government so that they can enable us to have the terrific benefits that AI can deliver, while retaining an appropriate level of privacy. Now, we can't hoard our data completely and not give it up at all and still get the benefits of AI. It won't work. So there has to be a trade-off. And where we choose to place ourselves on that tightrope, that's mixing the metaphors horribly, I don't think it's a moral issue. I think it's a pragmatic issue. So I think we should talk about beneficial AI and AI safety rather than AI ethics. Oh, and the other reason why I don't like the phrase AI ethics, and I'm really sorry to have attacked your profession,
I'm sold.
is that we mustn't fall into the trap of anthropomorphizing machines. They're not conscious. They don't know that we're talking about them. They don't care that we're talking about them. And if you talk about AI ethics, there's a danger that a lot of people will think we're talking about machines which have moral agency, and they don't, because they're not conscious and they're not moral agents. So there's those two reasons why I'm uncomfortable with the term AI ethics.
Very interesting. Mr. Bitar, you mentioned an ethical framework for AI that Microsoft follows in your presentation. And I know that your CEO often mentions an ethics vision of Microsoft. And I also know that Microsoft is part of a very large NGO, which is Partnership on AI, which is all about also ensuring ethics of AI. So what do you have to say about that?
The term ethics, what does that really mean? It's just the definition of the values of our normal behavior. And so whatever we do in life, we always use ethics to a certain extent. Now, I get where Callum's coming from in the sense that if you fall into the traps if you use ethics and you don't define it correctly. And I think that's the key distinction in terms of what we've defined as ethical AI to be and what people can perceive ethics of AI to be. And so where you can look at technology such as fire and electricity, we are the first generation to ever put AI between a human and another human. And so if we don't have a framework in such a sense that, we put in safety measures, reliability controls and SLAs as such, and also the capability of having transparency and accountability, then we can spin into a contributional kind of world. And so if you have an AI algorithm that judges people as part of replacing a judge in a court case, what happens if the AI algorithm says, yes, you need to go to prison? You need to be able to see and understand the transparency layer in terms of how that algorithm came to the decision. And so where we come from, where we stand, we're putting an ethical framework to ensure that the challenges that could be erased by AI is actually being dealt with the platform that we've created and offer.
Well, whether we call them ethics or benefits and harms, we've seen many initiatives, Dr. Saidi, across the world. We have different approaches. So, for example, we have the European Union that went for more stringent ethical guidelines. We have, on the other hand, the United States, which is on the other extreme of the continuum, where they're letting the market regulate itself. We have many countries in between. For instance, I know in Canada, we've had very recently the Montreal Declaration on Responsible AI. So how involved do you think that the government should be in regulating or not regulating AI? How do you see it in the specific context of Lebanon?
Well, I don't know about the specific context of Lebanon because I don't think it's on the policy agenda. So allow me not to get into that discussion of something which is purely existential in another world. I think what you need to ask, you ask a question about ethics. I think what you're really asking is not the ethics of the algorithm or the machine or whatever. You need to think of the user and the designer. You can design an algorithm with all the priors and the beliefs of humans. And that leads to issues of fairness. So for example, in credit rating systems, if you're not careful, what you do is you feed in the history of bias in the past. So if in the past, for example, dark-skinned people tended to default more for whatever reason, you train the AI to go back and look at all the records. It then goes into the algorithm. And what you're really doing is you're taking the biases of humans and putting them into the machine. It's not the fault of the algorithm or the machine. It's how you taught it and how you designed it. So I think the issue of the ethics has nothing to do with the machine itself. So I agree with Callum. We have to be very careful about being anthropomorphic and extending into machines and AI our own biases. I think that's a serious issue. I think what you need to do on the regulatory side is get rid of this idea that you want to regulate AI. You don't want to get into that business. Nobody thought of regulating a steam engine or electricity. AI is a tool that you want to use. I think what you need to have a discussion about is about the sectors in which you use AI. So if I'm looking at the financial sector and I'm looking at fintech, and so let me paint you a picture today of part of what's happening. Today, banks are highly regulated entities. They have to report to their supervisor, right? They have a regulatory authority. The regulatory authority specifies a whole number of data, and they have templates on this reporting. And they send out these circulars telling them, this is what you need to report to me about. This is very ineffective and really an outdated technology. What today you can do is to tell the bank, I want to go into your data and pick out from what your data everything that I need, okay? And I can have a machine-read regulation. So I have one algorithm or a machine at the regulator talking to another machine at the regulatee at the bank. So what you could have is an algorithm at the level of the regulator, talking to a bunch of algorithms within the bank. Now, how you design that, I think, is an interesting question. What are the sorts of questions? But at the end, what you're doing is you're regulating a particular sector because there are certain objectives. You're not regulating the AI itself or the algorithm itself. There is, however, a question of responsibility. If something goes wrong, say in an autonomous vehicle, and actually runs over somebody, who is responsible? I think that's still an open question. I don't think we've really addressed that. We haven't had any cases go to court, as far as I know, to understand. I don't think our courts are prepared to handle issues of that type. So I think what you need to ask is not regulating AI, but what sector regulation and how the sector regulation should be changing in the light of AI developments, because there's a big transformation now happening.
You're mentioning algorithm of the regulator and algorithm of the regulatee, and there's a lot of data involved there. How about data protection? Is it something, access to the data, is something that you believe that needs to be addressed at the government level, or?
I think you need a combination of both the industry itself as well as government in terms of guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Let's give an example. Many people may know of a company in California called Palantir. Palantir probably knows more about me than my wife and my kids and anybody else have dealt with in my life, because they can capture a lot of data, and in particular in the United States. And in other countries like China and others where data protection, and not just personal data protection, does not have guidelines,
Very relaxed.
and there are no standards, then that becomes an issue. And becomes an issue because at the end of the day, who owns this data? In principle, I should be owning my own data, and I should have the right to protect that data. In reality, that is not the case. A lot of data gets collected without permission and gets used without permission. If I sign on to a document which is typically 5 pages and it says agree at the end, none of us read actually what we're signing on to. How many of us? We just sign and agree. And by doing that, you're giving up a lot of your rights. So I think the real issues are, what are you going to do about the ownership of the data? But I think even more important is, I put up that slide about income shares. And it's clear that we're getting a combination of new technology plus globalization has meant a large increase in inequality in the world. And when we talk about the 1%, it is truly phenomenal. These are people who are now extremely powerful and extremely rich and can influence many things, including politics, and they do. And they can use AI and machine learning and everything else to influence voting and the rest. So I think those are the sorts of difficult issues that we need to address. It's not the technology, it's how you use it.
I'm glad you also mentioned bias earlier. I don't know if you're aware of a very recent example or a scandal, to be more precise, with Amazon. They used an HR recruiter, and they fed it with 10 years of labeled CV data. And then the HR recruiter of Amazon ended up favoring, for the same qualification, males over females. Yeah. So the bias of the human actually did get perpetuated by the machine. So Dr. Skaf, concerning that bias issue, what do you think are certain ways? Because there are certain technological ways and there are certain human ways of dealing with bias. How do you think that going forward we can mitigate the risk of that bias of AI?
And there's been, thanks, Mrs. Afuni. There's been a lot of writing on how even the people who are coding and developing the algorithms, if, for example, they're predominantly male, indirectly, you're going to propagate biases. Yeah. If the data sets that are being used are not debiased, also you're going to propagate that bias. So it's a combination of who you hire and who you deploy as engineers and people who are working on next generation AIs, what data you're using and how you can debias the data, and further having further checks and multiple algorithms that criticize the work of any single algorithm, so that you're checking for that also if you want to make it more and more automated and make use of the capabilities of AI. That's one set of measures that can help us debias the data and make sure we're not propagating historical biases. But I also wanted to mention something related to the provenance of data. So yes, when we sign up or to use any social media or any utility over the web, we do give up some rights related to the data. But it's important to always, for data to have provenance, that we know at any point in time when data shows up on a certain web utility or application, you can trace, it carries with it where it came from, who it belonged to, what individual has the right over that data, regardless of how it's propagated or aggregated as part of a function. And people should have the right to rescind that data or rescind the rights to use that data. And people should have the rights to be forgotten. And that's something that's in discussions right now. If someone wants to be totally off social media at some point in their life, they can, and the technology should enable that. It's not there yet, to totally be forgotten. And to meet those criteria, it's going to be a combination of the industry taking the initiative. Like, I didn't see anything about provenance of data in your ethical framework. I wrote down the notes, because it's against your interest to provide that provenance of data and to allow people to rescind the use of data. I mean, let's talk about that. So, and that's something that Sandy Pentland from the MIT Media Laboratory talks about. And when it comes back to ethics, I'd rather talk about value alignment and ownership of data. I'd rather think of it that way. Thank you.
So, Mr. Bitar, any comment?
So, yeah, just on the last point, the piece around having the capability to withdraw your data, that's based on the service you sign up. What I presented was a holistic view of artificial intelligence all up from Microsoft. And the points around being biased and ways of working, but that's an ethical question we as humanities are facing, and that's an ethical question you're addressing. And so there is a level of ethics that needs to be applied, whether you are applying it at the algorithm level or you're applying it at the industry level. You know, we can't take a look at electricity and say, hey, we don't have ethics on electricity. Well, we've just defined that AI is the capability of a computer to make decisions and think and behave like a human, right? And so electricity doesn't have that element of intelligence. And so when we start interacting with AI, we're feeding it with data, as you said, in your case around Amazon's case, that's a decision that the algorithm has been taken. And so bias is part of my ethical framework, you know, that Microsoft has put together, encapsulates that. And so it's a bunch of policies and rules, not to say to regulate things, but to make you more ethical in the way things are actually performed and how they interact with other humans. Because the last thing we would ever want is to have an algorithm that goes against our human race. And we want AI to be for good, for our sake, and not for a sake of any other type. But yeah, so it's a huge discussion that you can delve into. And I agree. It's the way you position ethics. Again, ethics is just a definition of values, of how you act and how you behave. We go into workplace, and we don't go into workplace thinking, oh, I'm not going to do my job properly. You're going to think, yes, I'm here to actually do my job in an ethical way. I'm going to behave in an ethical manner. And so there are a bunch of different parameters you can encapsulate, for sure.
And some of them are even automated, right? Because I know that some of the technology providers, they have now algorithms to test for bias.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah.
It's funny how we use AI for AI protection.
Exactly.
And well, we're not going to talk only about the harms. So on a more positive note, Mr. Shramek, you mentioned that AI can be an opportunity for smaller nations at the end of your presentation. And we are a smaller nation here. So I was wondering if you could tell us, how do you think a country like Lebanon, what can it do, what can it change to be able to leverage this small nation advantage in AI?
Yeah, so I know it very well because I'm coming also from small country. There are several small countries in Central Europe, and but in AI, I don't think there are borders, country borders. If you are working with AI, so you are mainly working with all the global markets, and any individual, even coming from small country, can do the large things. So we have no objections. We have all the opportunities in our hands. So there is no need to do anything special, especially from top to bottom. So you need to eliminate some barriers. So you need to have maybe a good infrastructure, the data, internet connectivity. But then you need to allow the people to work with these opportunities. So maybe in kind of a motivation or positive examples So this is what they need to see and act on this from the position of a small country and to see the global markets.
And we talked a lot about, you actually talked, all of you mostly, about jobs and impact on jobs. I like the idea of abundance that you have mentioned in your presentation, but I'm just thinking about the transition period in these kinds of situations is often very painful. How do you see this transition happening, and what could be done, in your opinion, to make it the least painful possible?
So first of all, it's important to say we do not know what's going to happen. Anthony was quite right. There are no crystal balls. There is no data about the future, so we can't analyze our way out of this. I think we should be doing scenario planning. I think we should be thinking about the possible outcomes and look at the good possible outcomes and try to work out, are they possible? And then if they are, how do we nudge the unfolding events in that direction? And I've been thinking about this a long time. I first wrote about the possibility of technological unemployment back in 1980. It was for a college newspaper rather than anything more serious. But and I thought that technological unemployment was probably coming in the next 10 years, and clearly I was wrong. And people have been wrong over and over and over again about automation causing unemployment. But what we always say is this time it might be different. And guess what? This time it might be different. I have not heard a recipe for dealing with technological unemployment, if it comes, and we don't know, that makes any sense, apart from abundance. Because if we are going to have an economy where a minority of people own the AI and therefore own most of the economy, because AI will power most of the economy, and there's a large number of people who are unemployable, that's a dystopian outcome. Any which way you cut it, unless we get the prices of the goods and services down close to zero. It seems to me that's the only way to make it work. But there must be some other ideas that are possible. It's just I haven't heard any of them yet.
I saw a hand. Yeah, there was a hand over there. Would you like to ask a question? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, sure. Microphone, please. I can just speak very loud. Can you hear?
Yeah.
So I think that it's very interesting questions and points. I mean, the idea though that the outcome that will help deliver a positive future when it's otherwise so bleak is this idea of abundance. Again, makes it feel like there's a solution that is possible, but that we don't have any evidence around. Except that if we look into our history, we don't have a very good history globally of building a world that supports equality, that supports opportunity, that is not prejudice and does not have states and individuals fighting for the most and dominating others. In my mind, the future that we need to build is diversification. We need to, right now, the aspect of inequality is the most dangerous, that there are so few humans, individuals, let alone cities and hubs, that have so much massive power that's normally run by men, which is another problem, in terms of, we know that when men get wealthier, what do they do with their wealth, versus when women get wealthier, what do they do with their wealth? So how do we massively expand the diversification of these opportunities and build in these aspects of resilience? I guess resilience, in my mind, is a safer bet than this kind of prosperity of abundance, because we don't have any example of that in the world. But we know that if we look at communities where there is much stronger equality and much stronger resilience, is that people will figure out that. So how do we make these things way more equal around the world? I guess that's the thing that I see is the only opportunity for the brighter future is by enabling thousands and millions more to be working to develop that brighter future.
Yeah, please.
So a diversity of approaches is a great idea, and that's what's going to happen. There's 200 countries or so thereabouts in the world, and I'm sure each one will take a different approach, and we'll find out which ones work and which ones don't work. I realised I completely failed to answer your question, which was how do we get from here to there? And I think probably the most important thing is to realise that whatever is going to happen in 30 years' time, we've got to get from here to there, and we're going to get a lot of churn. So we're going to get a lot of people being thrown out of one job and having to retrain for another job. And you know, in my parents' lifetime, that didn't happen. In my lifetime, it happened to people once or twice, and in the current generation, it's going to happen several times, and in the next generation, it will happen dozens of times. So we must get much, much better at reskilling and re-education. And fortunately, education is going to be swept across by AI in ways that most teachers have no clue. We're going to have bots educating people much better than humans educate people. That's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. So that may get us out of that pickle. So AI may revolutionize education in a way which enables us to survive the churn. With regard to how we get from here to abundance, if it's going to happen, it will happen anyway. It will happen just through economic logic. We will take humans out of the production process, and that will be both a good thing because it reduces prices and a bad thing because it increases unemployment. Energy prices will carry on going down. The cost of solar cells is on an exponentially declining cost curve, and production will get more efficient because AI will make it more efficient. So we'll get there anyway. The question is whether we get to abundance in time for people not to panic about unemployment. That's the big issue there. One other thing about inequality. There is a growing populism of the left, which is every bit as dangerous as the populism of the right, which has given us Putin, has given us Trump, has given us Brexit. It is not true that inequality is much worse today than it's ever been. It's nonsense. Most of human history has been characterized by one or two extraordinarily rich people who owned everything, and everybody else was dirt poor and subsistence farmers. Now, there's an enormous middle class around the world. And it isn't just China. China has lifted 750 million people out of abject poverty over the last 25 years, and that's fantastic. That's a huge decrease in inequality. But it isn't just China. India is doing the same thing. It's even happening in Africa. The world is less unequal now than it has been for most of its history. And the idea that capitalism is somehow this monstrous beast which is gobbling up the world and making everything terribly unfair is really dangerous. Capitalism has made the world better today than it's ever been. And you see that because of where it's absent, how bad it is. You know, North Korea, Venezuela, the list goes on. They show how good capitalism is. It's not perfect. It's very far from perfect, but it's better than what we've had before.
Dr. Saidi, I saw you wanted to say something.
You asked I don't know what's going to happen in 20, 30 years' time. I have no crystal ball. If I look at the work as economists done by people like Bill Nordhaus, the team at MIT and all the rest, the idea that you'll have a singularity in the immediate future seems outlandish. At best, the estimates that we look at, maybe you could have something maybe in 70 to 100 years. I mean, that's the best work that we've had so far. But I want to address your other question, what do you do in the transition? There's some very serious work being done by economists at the moment, various labs all over, but particularly MIT, Harvard, and a couple of other places, where they're breaking down the first thing that we need to do is to have a survey of the skills in your population, detailed survey of skills. That's been done already in Europe, United States, so you have a reasonably good idea of what are the skills available in the economy. You need to start with that. We don't have that in any of the Arab countries. So one of the first starting points that you need to do is to start off what sort of skills do you have. Second, I think you need to go into every job and occupation and say what are the tasks that are required to fulfill that job, whether it's gardening, whether it's a radiologist or anything else. That work has been done now. So we now have a breakdown of the different tasks, and they're much more complicated than what we think. So if you think of somebody who's in the food and beverage industry, who's into catering, They do many more things than just coming and giving us the food on our table. There's a lot in the supply process. So you have to look across the whole chain of production and ask, what are the tasks? And then the next question you need to ask is, what tasks can be done by a machine, which are tasks which are repetitive, that are not necessarily cognitive, etc. And that work has started to be done. And we now have a reasonable idea of what tasks are likely to be replaced by a machine. And there's a metric for that. Now, in the transition, you need to ask yourself, well, let's look at the sectors. Let's look at the different regions of the country we are in, and which sectors are the most vulnerable, which activities are the most vulnerable, and what do I do about it? What do I do about it from a social policy point of view, from an industrial planning point of view, in terms of what sort of safety nets do I put in there, etc. There's a whole bunch of things and tools that you want to use, economic and social. I think that's what you need to do in planning. What I think concerns me a lot is that there's a lot of thinking going on about that in, let's call them advanced countries, United States, Europe, and elsewhere. There's very little going on anywhere else. And what worries me is that the availability of the technology, the availability of AI and machine learning might be, and the ownership of that is going to be in very limited hands. That is an issue. How do you avoid greater inequality between countries, let alone within countries? If just a few companies, and we know who they are, in China, United States, and elsewhere, own the technology and own the data behind the technology, then what are the rest going to be doing? I think that is a serious issue of concern. So how are you going to make the technology available? From that point of view, I'm more comfortable with a China than I am with the United States. Why with a China? Because at the end of the day, there is a state with wide ownership in a deep sense, okay? So they're using it maybe for purposes some of us or many of us don't like, but in terms of the ownership of the AI, I think it's probably better owned in China's case than it is elsewhere. So my main concern would be, during the transition process, are we prepared? The answer is we are not prepared. Are there tools? Yes, I think we can think of tools. Are we developing them? Slightly. My main concern, particularly in our small country and across the Arab world, is that we are not prepared. And we are already facing a major gap. We're highly dependent on our natural resources, on oil and gas for production and exports, and not just the oil-producing country. All of us are linked to the GCC countries. And if there is no adjustment, the future looks very bleak. I work a lot in clean energy and clean technology. I agree on solar. Solar is going to become ubiquitous. If that happens, then the oil price can go down very rapidly over a relatively short period of time, 20, 25 years, down to maybe $15 per barrel, maybe less. And what you will have is a lot of stranded assets. What we mean by stranded assets is that the oil and gas may be there, but it may not be economical to extract because you've got an alternative technology that is cheaper, cleaner, and means nobody wants your oil. So we need to plan for that future. And I guess at the moment, I don't see us planning for that future. But in terms of answering the question about transition, I think we're starting to get the tools of what do you need to retrain, to train, reskill people so that they go out of certain occupations which are more vulnerable to others which may be less vulnerable.
Well, it's true that in our region we're relatively less prepared than other places. But even in, Dr. Skaf, even in other, let's say in the developed countries, are they really prepared for what Mr. Chase called the abundance for later on? For example, if we talk about the ownership, you stressed a lot the ownership. Amazon, Facebook, Google, what's in it for them? They have ownership of this great wealth, which is the huge data. What's in it for them so that they can be cooperative, if I can put it between quotes, in reaching abundance?
Thank you, Mrs. Afuni. there are multiple layers to answer this question. Let me go back to the inequality issue. I'm going to get back to this because it's very much at the core of what Facebook and Google and Amazon are offering. They're offering greater value, a better experience to the customers in return of using their data. So everyone has been better off. In fact, if there is research now that Google search, that utility, if you take it away from people, from any individual, it's like stealing $17,000 from them. Literally, they've. So if I were to force someone, one of us, or I'm forced not to live with Google search, it's like somebody taking away the equivalent of seven. And that number actually changes by the rank of the person, their income, how they trade dollars versus leisure, etc. So all these companies, because of the network effect and how they're making use of data to provide better services and value to customers, have come up with this trait. You give me your data, I'll use it at the aggregate level, individual level, and give you better value and a better experience. But let's go back to the inequality. People, for some reason, they put too much emphasis and weight on equality. The question that should be is, are we as a species better off today than 500 years ago? And will we be, suppose we take Callum's steady state outcome of reaching this world of abundance. And there are so many ways you can get there, but the transition is key and critical. Will people be better off or not? Making everybody equal in misery is not progress. And that's what a whole 70 years was spent between 1917 and 1989, 1990 on, and it was a very bad experience. And I'm so glad that capitalism prevailed because it's a much better system. So are we better off? People now live better than emperors back in the 1700s or 1800s. So we're better off as a species. So inequality is, or equality is overrated. What matters is, are we better off? Now, in terms of how we can get to Callum Chase's perspective or steady state in abundance, there are many ways you can get to it, but I can see some possibilities. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be difficult to manage the transition, but if people can administer diagnosis, medical diagnosis to themselves, some part of medical treatment to themselves. They can have machines generate on a smaller piece of land due to higher productivity, food at cheaper prices. They can print, 3D print or additive manufacturing, print their clothes and utensils at minimal cost. All they are buying is just raisin from time to time. I can see how the cost of all this can decline so that you can live on a lower income, okay, and barter between people, and you can get to that. The main thing is managing the transition, and the transition can be really long and it can be short. And the transition will happen in different ways across countries, across economies. Managing that transition is where the challenges are. Whether we get to the steady state, I think the risks are going to be in the transition, and that's where doing scenario planning and doing the thought processes and having different think tanks weigh in on this will be critical. And yes, upon the start of any battle, the plans go to waste. But having gone through the scenario planning and having anticipated the various potential outcomes and potential areas of failure will help, whether it's decision makers in the private sector or decision makers in the public sector, figure out how we can manage the transition and get us to the steady state.
Thank you, Dr. Saidi. Before I move on with the questions, if there are any questions in the audience, please just raise your hand. We'll make it as interactive as you would like it to be. So, okay, yes, please. Can you have the microphone, please?
Hi, since you mentioned AI in medicine, at a recent conference, there was discussion on developing the algorithms, the training and testing sets that are used. So for example, not just taking diagnostic algorithms from Germany and applying them to Lebanon, but using Lebanese data sets to modify or at least test the algorithms and possibly train and improve on the algorithms. So I think when we talk about how many jobs do we need in this and what the skill set needs to be, it raises the level of skills needed around the world, really, because if you're going to start extending algorithms, you really need to know the basic science of AI and not just say, okay, we already bought this equipment from Siemens and it has the AI included, so we're just going to apply it here. So I think that really we need to know across the sectors whether that's actually required, the localization of AI, or whether we're going to keep depending on a few centers of excellence around the world and get the technology from them.
Good question. And what saves us is the fact that, especially if you're using deep learning, with the new data, we get your AI to learn about the population that you care about, to the extent there is differences due to genes or other markers or other factors, it will learn. I'll give you another example. We're working with a cybersecurity company that uses unsupervised learning, and it has no recorded signatures of cyber threats. You put it behind your network, and it learns how your network is behaving. And then after literally a very short period of time, it will figure out if there is an anomaly or an unusual usage from one of the terminals or even one of the devices connected to the network. And no network is like another network. And that's why it has an advantage, because it's using complete unsupervised learning. And similarly, we can have that in medical diagnosis, etc.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Chase. You mentioned something about defeating death in the future. So what would be this, in case we succeeded, as an impact on humanity and all the, I mean, humanity as a whole?
Well, I think it'd be a rather good thing if we didn't have to die anymore. Both my parents died when I was quite young, and it was very sad. And I have a 17-year-old son, and I'd really like to see what happens to him as he gets older. I will be gutted if I'm on my deathbed and he's in his early 20s or early 30s even, and I don't know what becomes of him. And I imagine, I don't know, that he'd be sad as well. So I think death is a bad thing, and we should stop it if we can. And I think it probably is doable. The best theory I know of why we die is that there are 7 forms of cellular breakdown. We know what they are. We know more or less what causes them. We know more or less how to fix them. But they are phenomenally complicated. It's not just, there's not just the genetics. It's the epigenetics. So it's orders of magnitudes of difficulty in solving them. But if we have superintelligence, it could possibly solve them. So would that bring its own problems? I mean, the thing that most people think about is, well, won't the world get overcrowded? And there's this meme that we're using up 3 Earths already, and we've only got the one. Firstly, what happens when people get rich is they have fewer kids, and the world is getting richer, and so we are having fewer kids, and the UN forecast is that the population will stabilize and then start to decrease. And I think it's the current view is it's going to get to just below 10 million before it starts to go down again slightly. And if you reduce the childbirth rate, you get an awful lot of leeway for extra longevity. So one extra child knocks off a great deal or one fewer children knocks off a great deal of longevity. I can't explain the mass of that, but it is true. So that's one thing. Another thing is that as time goes on, people are going to be living more and more digital lives. Ultimately, perhaps we'll all live mostly in virtual reality, which is very light on consumption of raw materials. It uses a certain amount of energy, but that will get more efficient. And then another thing is that we will be living on other planets. People will be moving to other planets. Perhaps not unaugmented humans, because space is very unfriendly for unaugmented humans. But as we become increasingly cyborgs, as I was surprised to hear Dr. Saidi say, it's safer for us to travel into space. We can deal with the radiation better. We can deal with long journeys. So we will populate other planets and eventually other solar systems and perhaps eventually other galaxies. And there's an awful lot of real estate out there. We're just occupying one tiny little dot. So I'm not worried about overpopulation. Sadly, we're not going to cure death in the next 2 or 3 years. I sadly think I may be too old. You're a spring chicken, you can make it. There's a nice idea of longevity escape velocity, which is we get to a point where scientists give us an extra year of life every year that goes by, And so we sort of stop getting older, and then quickly we move past that and we get into rejuvenation. There are people who say that if we spent enough money on the problem, we could easily get to longevity escape velocity within 10 years. I think they are probably wildly optimistic. Maybe it's doable in 20. Sadly, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I think it's quite possible my son might be among the first generation that doesn't have to die. And I just think that's a flat-out good thing.
Well, I think we need, yeah, one question.
To Peter, what is the secret of how you can attract talent for your incubator? Is it an incubator? How you get the money? How you create these success use cases that you called?
Yeah, this is about to make it different than the others do. So if you are talking about enabling the entrepreneurs by accelerators or incubators program, so they are mostly the same. So their approach is very general. So they are not specialized. So we were focusing on AI as a key technology. And we were looking into the particular industries. So looking for application of that AI in these industries. And then we write that all program by the consisting of the funding mentors and the in-house specialized, including PhDs in AI, was very attractive for companies from all around the world, even from other continents, even from Silicon Valley. So you need to be very focused, and you need to increase the value you are bringing to the entrepreneurs, and then they will come.
Well, I've been told we have a few more minutes. If anyone has some more questions, yes, Dr. Naash.
Actually, my question is addressed to anyone on the panel. I just don't know enough about AI to answer this question in my mind. Who are the people who develop AI systems? Are they only people with a background in computer science, or you need industry knowledge too? To explain myself more, if you are developing an AI system that is related to diagnosing cancer, what is the proportion of people involved in developing this system who are just, IT specialists to those who are medical doctors? Because this, in a way, would tell us if we don't need industry knowledge as much as we need the IT knowledge, maybe we end up at some time where we have less doctors or less intelligent doctors and depend more on IT people.
So I can take a stab at it first. So from our perspective, it really depends on what you want to try and achieve. Now, what you'll find is you'll find a lot of vendors that will start offering AI creation in a more user-friendly way. And so while if you're technical, you will have capabilities to go off down that stream and do what you want to do using your technical capabilities. We have the offering where you don't have to be technical to achieve AI right now. So any user can go onto a platform, and the example obviously is Microsoft's, and you can just drag and drop a bunch of boxes that are labeled in just layman terms that anyone can understand, and you can create a flow of what you're trying to achieve. So if you want to achieve, for example, moving object A to position B, you can achieve that just by creating a flow in the platform. And so what I foresee is we're going to start having this AI offering that is going to be so user-friendly that anyone can do it. Now, the special touch is the industry-specific knowledge. Where you want to cure cancer or whether you want to diagnose diabetes from retinal image, you need domain expertise there. And so there are two levels. There's a complexity level and there's the simplicity piece. Simplicity piece we will cater for. Complexity piece you can cater for plus the industry knowledge specifics.
Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, so I can explain what are our priorities when evaluating and selecting startups, because the consistency of the team is very the key. So we are always looking for industry expertise. This is a must. So you need someone who understands the problem, who owns the problem, and ideally who has access to the data. So the understanding of the problem is the key. Then you need of course the IT people capable to play with all of these frameworks and Microsoft or other tools, because there are plenty of them, and you need to be very effective. You need to do the rapid experimentation, and you as an industry expert will not play with these boxes. And then potentially you need an AI expert if you want to be very different from others. But it's not necessary to be a PhD capable expert. And what is very important is to know that you can cooperate within the team with people from different geographies. So you just need to be industry expert, and you can cooperate with IT expert from India and some PhD expert from Europe. And that's absolutely fine. Many startups are located on several continents. So we have teams with 5 people, and they are coming from different parts of the world.
I would just add, there is also a new class of trilinguals that we talk about now. People who can speak the industry, the domain, who can speak the data and analytics and AI, and speak technology. And these are critical, especially in strategic applications of AI. And I'll give you an example. A fragrance and perfumes manufacturer has worked for 2 years to use AI in guiding the selection of new perfumes. And they give it a lot of data from sales, etc. And they had people who are expert in the domain working with the AI team. And the initial instances of the recommendations that were coming up, the AI was recommending the use of shampoo, fragrances, and perfume. And the reason that was the case, because they saw the data on sales of shampoo, it was much larger than the perfumes, because these are smaller batches of sales, and you needed the human expertise to correct for that and guide the AI as to which data to use and otherwise. And that's why you need these trilinguals to make the best use of AI applications in industry.
I have a question about something you all mentioned, which is skilling and reskilling in the transition period, because we all agree that the transition is a critical issue for this generation and the generation after. So I think there's a paradox here that we say we need to skill and reskill for AI for us to face the challenge of AI, but at the same time, you mentioned in your presentation lawyers, and that AI can take care of the boring tasks. And the boring tasks are actually what fresh graduate lawyers do, which is going through precedence cases and assisting the senior lawyers in preparing for the case. How is it that those fresh lawyers can be skilled in their jobs if they don't have a chance to practice the boring tasks? So in other words, is machine learning taking away from human learning?
Good question.
That's a very good question. So simply, we don't know, or I don't know. but I can assume that these juniors don't need to sit for several years just doing the same stuff, analyzing the same or similar agreements. So they need to do it for some time or to assist to the seniors, but not at such extent. So maybe it could be a more linear process for applying these technologies. First, helping these juniors, a second, replacing most of their work, but then they will be allowed to assist to the seniors and do the real work, to learn from these other people, not from these papers.
I worked for 5 years for KPMG, and I'm not an accountant, but I saw lots of junior accountants doing the ticking and bashing, which is the ghastly, boring work that accountants do when they're learning their trade, and it's the analogy to what lawyers do when they're doing the discovery process. And a cynical person might say that the partners in the big audit firms have these junior people doing the ticking and bashing because they can sell their time for sort of 200 or 300 quid an hour for doing machine work, and they keep them doing it for 5 years because it's very profitable. There's a nice idea that when slide rules were invented, engineers no longer needed to work with compute tables. Originally, the word computer meant a human being. It was a human being who used a table to do arithmetical functions. Slide rules came along and wiped that work out, but engineers didn't disappear. They just kind of leapt up the value chain more quickly. Maybe other professionals can do that. They can leap up the value chain quickly because the AI will take the boring grunt work away rather than it making it impossible to train them to be the future partners. But of course, eventually the partners' jobs will be taken over by machines anyway.
I'd like to add the fact that the half-life of any skill we're learning has really decreased. 50 years ago, you'd get an engineering degree and it'll last you for your degree or for your career, 20, 25 years. The half-life recently came down to 6 years on any skill. I think it's going to be shrinking further, and people need to learn that they will need to reskill and reskill again, and that's where the role of organizations like the OEA becomes very critical, creating the opportunities and the courses to reskill our workforce. That's one thing. The other thing, and I disagree with the perspective Dr. Saidi presented. He said, oh, repetitive tasks will be taken away from the machines. That was déjà passé. We've seen that before. What's going to be taken away are very cognitively intensive tasks that are measurable, and the machines are going to get very good at that, and people will have to drive the productivity and earn the productivity that we're going to get from AI on a continuous basis, repackage tasks, define new jobs, and as the machines improve, we're going to do that again, and maybe every year or two, people will have to reskill. This is going to be intense, especially in the transition period. The other thing that I would mention also is that it skips me right now. There was a third thought, but basically organizations like us, even universities, the definition of a university and how you get your learning and how you get your reskilling will change tremendously.
Maybe we take one last question and then we need to wrap up. I'm sorry, he had his, yeah, sorry. And Miss will take your question right afterwards. We will go. Yeah.
So when you were first talking about singularity and how it's gonna affect our lives, you were talking about intelligence, AGI and ASI, but what was not really thoroughly studied is the consciousness in the human bodies, because most singularity materialists totally elude the problem, if I might say, of us having bodies. And a lot of what we feel and sense and think is influenced by trillions and trillions of biochemical reactions that happen in our body. So isn't that a big problem for pro-singularity materialists, if I may say? And okay.
No. If you are paralyzed from the neck down, you don't suddenly stop being you. This is an extreme view. I want to be frozen when I reach the end of my life, and I'm not going to bother freezing my body, I'm just going to freeze my head. I think the important thing about us is our brains. Actually, it's our minds, and our minds are things that run on the computers that our brains are. You are not what you eat, you are what you think. And I think the rest is just happenstance and trivial. It is an extreme view, I agree, but that's my view.
If I may add, suppose a machine, when we get to AGI, it'll be easy to do that. Suppose a machine that has deep learning and other AI solutions, because we need more than deep learning to get to AGI, becomes so capable of mimicking you, your exact thoughts, and can perform better under stress, whether it's in a negotiation or in an adverse environment, and you have to choose whether you send yourself or you send the machine. to represent you in such a negotiation or such an adverse environment, which one would you send? And it exactly mimics you and has all the history. The machine. So
yeah, I mean,
so then, and even so, and let's take it further. Suppose the machine became so representative of you, and you decide to go live on some rock in the southern Pacific and keep the machine behind. Would you care? Maybe it's going to perform better than you in terms of managing your wealth, dealing with your family, and dealing with all your legacy. So who knows? And then you can take it further. I don't want to take it further.
Well, I'll take it further. One question, Miss, if you had something to say, and then we'll let the panelists give us their last thoughts.
We heard a lot about how we are lagging behind here in Lebanon, and how it's basically a utopia that anything's going to change anytime soon. I was wondering, like, what is the first step we can take? I mean, how do you convince a government that is corrupt and a society that is rampant with corruption that they're going to have to take steps that will make it more difficult to be corrupt and earn money from that, and eliminate bureaucracy that is also making them money? So what would be the first step? That's my question.
Who would like to volunteer?
Bribe them.
وداوني بالتي كانت هي الداء. Can you translate?
Basically, she's saying, treat them with that which is the disease itself, which is what you said. And that's a saying we have here.
Yeah. So I really thank you all, panelists, but I'm going to give you just very quickly for each of you a last comment or thought that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap it up. So let's start with you, Mr. Pitar.
Sure. So from our perspective, from a Microsoft standpoint, we're looking at empowering every single person on the planet to do more. And whether you're technical or non-technical, the platform that Microsoft has is being widely embedded, even at the university level, to try and enhance the skill sets we have here in Beirut. So whatever skill sets in terms of data science, artificial intelligence, acquiring, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to touch base and connect you with the relevant people. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that we're having the right discussion at the right time at a country that we still hope will wake up to listen to the issues. I'd like to thank the Order of Engineers and Architects and the head of the scientific committee, our colleague, Mr. Wissam Tawil, and our masterful MC, Dr. Nakash, for making this a very memorable event. I'd like to thank Ms. Zvania Afuni Mullah for moderating this session. Thank you so much. She came in from Canada, and LebNet. I want to mention that LebNet, the Professional Society of Lebanese Entrepreneurs and Technologists, is supporting this conference and partnering with the OEA on this, and they've sent 4 speakers, and our best representative is Mrs. Rania. So thank you so much, and
thank you.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you.
I'd like to wind up by giving a less cynical, more sensible answer to your question. Lebanon's a great country. This place is resilient beyond belief. And you have such talent. I lived in Dubai for 3 years, and I met quite a few Lebanese people because they were running all the companies out there. It's a bit like you're the kind of the Chile. Chile is the South American equivalent of Lebanon. And so you have huge talent, you have huge opportunities, and you're a small country, which means that you could digitize your government services much more easily than a lot of big countries. I listened to a man who was hired from Amazon to digitize Italy's government, and it was a nightmare. He didn't get very far. He was delighted with the tiny, tiny progress he made. A country this size could do it much more easily. I think Dr. Saeedi's analogy of Estonia was really interesting. I think you should model yourselves on Estonia. Now, they have a much more homogenous society. It's probably easier for them in many ways, but I think the future could be great for Lebanon if you decided to take the bull by the horns and to go for it.
Yeah, so there was a lot of topics discussed, but I would like to add one more comment to the last question about the government and the environment. So please think about what is blocking you from doing the first step and then the next step. If all of these people will answer this question, then maybe they can rely that they can do the steps.
Well, I'm really honored to have been part of such an interesting and enlightening discussion. Thank you all, and also honored to be one of the representatives of LabNet here. And of course, thank you very much to the Order, to the Scientific Committee, President and members, and for your wonderful organization. And thank you to Dr. Naash and to all. And please join me thanking the panelists for their very enlightening ideas. Thank you very much.